Hello, everyone. Like they said, my name is Clement, a DPhil student in international development, focused on climate change, resilience, and adaptation in Africa. And we are really behind time today, so I'll just go right straight into it. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge you all for coming, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, fellow change makers. Good morning and welcome to the Climate, Sustainability, and Environment panel at the 2025 Oxford Africa Conference. It's an honor to convene to have this important discussion under the theme Bridging the Gap, Unlocking Climate Finance for Resilience and Adaptation in Africa. Today, we gather at this critical moment, one where climate crisis is no longer a looming threat, but a lived reality to millions across the African continent. Rising temperatures, failed rains, devastating floods, food insecurity, and ecological devastation are reshaping lives and the futures of Africa. For Africa, there is a need for climate action, and it is urgent. We need it now. It is not aspirational, it is essential. And yet the continent finds itself as a crossroad. There is a climate paradox now. Even though Africa contributes less to climate change, it is the most vulnerable to climate change, and it is the least resourced to adapt and to be resilient in the face of climate change. Africa does not lack the vision. What it lacks is the action. What it lacks is access to capital, fair partnerships, lack of quality decision-making, and how climate finance is distributed across board. This panel is about changing that narrative. We will interrogate questions of structural inequalities embedded in global finance mechanisms, systems that too often prioritize donor agencies over local priorities. We will explore why access remains so elusive and what it takes to bridge that gap. We will spotlight innovation tools that offer scalable solutions for resilience and adaptation in Africa. And crucially, we would ask, who is getting funded, for what purpose, and with whose voices it's at the center? That is at the critical issues of climate justice. Without much ado, I would like to introduce our panelists for today. And the first would be Dr. Olumide Abimbola, sorry for that, Olumide Abimbola, the founder and executive director of the Africa Policy Research Institute. Please, you can do better for him. The next panelist would be Dr. Amo-Agyemang, a senior lecturer in environmental politics at the University of Ghana. And on a personal note, Dr. Amo-Agyemang was my lecturer at the University of Ghana. In fact, I'm here studying in Oxford partly because of him. He supported my application, and he's been my mentor since I was at the University of Ghana. Thank you so much, Doc, for honoring our invitation. And the next would be Vanessa Nakate, who is a climate activist doing her MPP here at the University of Oxford. She's spoken at several UN events, and she's the lead for the UN Sustainable Development Goals Young Leader. Give it a round of applause for Vanessa as well. And the last panelist would be Ms. Uzo, or we all call Uzoamaka Nwamarah, and she is a climate change advisor at the Climate Change and Oceans Directorate at the Commonwealth Secretariat. Please give it up for Uzo. We were expecting the Minister of Environment for Ghana to be here, but just as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Okujeto, mentioned, he couldn't make it here. But we have a great line of panelists to begin with the conversation. Thank you so much. I'll take a seat. Okay, I know we are out of time, and I believe most of the delegates here are here for this panel, and they have a lot of questions. So I'm just going to first stick to asking a few questions for maybe the first 25 to 30 minutes, and then I'll open it up to questions so that we can all discuss. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Olumide. The first question would have to do with access to climate finance. I want you to, since you do a lot of policy stuff, I want you to talk us through some of the challenges, either structural or financial, political challenges, that sort of inhibit Africa from accessing climate finance.
Thank you very much, Clement, for inviting me to be here. Before I try to answer the question, I want to just walk us through a few data points that show where we are on climate finance in Africa. So according to a study that was done in 2022, Africa requires about $2.8 trillion to finance its NDCs. So for those who are not into climate diplomacy jargons, NDCs are documents that contain the commitments that countries have made to contribute to the reduction of emissions globally, right, under the Paris Agreement. So in order for Africa to finance its NDCs fully, Africa needs $2.8 trillion from 2020 to 2030. Last year, a study was done that shows that about $44 billion come to Africa on climate finance yearly. And that comes to about 23% of the required amount. So that leaves 77% unfunded. So out of the $44 billion that comes to Africa, or that African governments have access to, 90% of that comes from external sources, and close to half of that is from banks, MDBs, so the development banks like the World Bank, the AFDB, and so on. Private sector financing, and given the climate that we're in right now, where we are seeing cuts, I know the Honorable Minister says we don't need the money, but let's assume we need it a little bit. Private financing makes up, I think, 18% of that. So that means that there is no private financing coming towards Africa. The money that comes is generally coming from the MDBs, so the development banks, and it's not even close to what is required for countries to be able to finance the NDCs that they prepared. And that's not only it. Only 10 countries account for 50% of those flows. And the 10 most vulnerable countries access only 10% of those flows. So that shows you the problem that we're dealing with here of access to finance for African countries. And again, most of the financing that comes to Africa comes in a form of loans, not grants. And that's a problem, because now we're getting to the problems and the challenges of accessing these financings. Because if you're an African country right now, it's difficult for you to borrow more, in part because your fiscal space is not that healthy, but also because the global financial architecture was not created to serve you. So you have a situation in which an African country with the same credit rating as, say, Belarus would borrow at a higher rate than Belarus, right? That's a problem. And you have it's a problem that is not easy to fix, because there have been discussions about it severally, and there will be another one in Sevilla next month, Financing for Development conference, to discuss it. But there is no easy solution to this. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is most countries in Africa also don't have very strong local capital markets. And if you don't have that, you can't really tap into domestic markets to raise financing for development in your country, including climate finance. So those are some of the challenges and some of the structural issues that need to be addressed in order for African countries to be able to access this financing. I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have some follow-up questions, but I'm not going to do it now. I'm going to do it in the second round. So Dr. Charles, I'm going to ask you this question. A few years ago, I know you were in class, you were asking me questions at the University of Ghana. Now the tables are flipped, and I'm the one to ask you some difficult questions. So Dr. Charles, can you talk us through the issues of resilience and adaptation in Africa? Usually resilience and adaptation is defined by donors, is defined by the West, and how these Eurocentric views and understanding of resilience. Can you talk us through what the African sort of definition or understanding of resilience would be? I know you write a lot on resilience in order to enlighten some of our delegates here. So you take us through some resilience and adaptation and issues of that, connecting it to the debate of climate finance.
Okay, thank you very much. Resilience, as we know, from the Eurocentric perspective, is too technocratic and bureaucratic. It is more about KPIs and metrics. If you look at the pervasive and dominant perspective of resilience from the donor's angle, it's about bouncing back from shock as quickly as possible from a misfortune or an environmental stress. But within African context, resilience is relational. Resilience is not about bouncing back quickly as possible from a misfortune or stress or from an environmental stress. Resilience in Africa is embedded in Africa's spirituality to the environment. Resilience within the African context is embedded in Africa's ancestral knowledge to the environment. But the donors, or the pervasive or dominant understanding of resilience from the West, they think that resilience is all about some project-based metrics. And for me, that is hugely problematic. Again, if you talk about adaptation, within the African context, adaptation is understood differently. Adaptation is not about a coping mechanism. Within the African context, adaptation is choosing how to live in conditions of what? Crisis. And I think that we should begin to reconceptualize and rethink resilience and adaptation beyond the donor-driven frameworks. In that way, we will be on the way in making strides in terms of dealing with our environmental problems in Africa.
All right, thank you very much, Doc. I would move to Vanessa. Vanessa, I know you've been a global voice on issues of climate justice and issues relating to climate finance. I want to ask you briefly, how does the lack of climate finance reflect patterns of global inequalities?
Thank you very much. So firstly, we need to understand why we have the climate crisis in the first place. It is as a result of burning fossil fuels, and that is coal, oil, and gas. And the countries that have historically extracted and developed from this extraction have been countries in the global north. However, when we talk about the impacts of climate change, we see that they are mostly seen in countries that are not responsible for the crisis, in countries that did not historically benefit from the extraction or develop from the extraction of fossil fuels. And many of those countries are in the global south. I will speak specifically on African countries. So Africa as a continent is responsible for less than 4% of the global emissions. And yet, so many African countries are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Whatever climate disaster that you can think of, it is happening on the African continent. We have seen how cyclones have ripped apart southern parts of Africa and led to the loss of lives, destroyed property, destroyed livelihoods, destroyed sources of income. We have seen how droughts are affecting people in the Horn of Africa in areas like Turkana, threatening their food security, water security, their existence. So you realize that the climate crisis is heavily impacting a continent that is not responsible for it. So for me, the aspect of justice, climate finance, and how it relates to global inequalities, it is firstly in understanding the historical injustice, which is the climate crisis. Secondly, it is the issue of the finance failures that we have seen. Many of you who are probably working in the climate space know about the $100 billion of climate finance that was promised by developed countries to developing nations to address climate change. We are in 2025, and that promise has never been fulfilled. This kind of finance failure results in the suffering of so many communities. And like my fellow panelist, Dr. Olumide, talked about, the loans are not grants. The money that has come from this climate finance is creating another problem, and that is the debt crisis. Many African countries are already experiencing a debt crisis, but now they need to address climate change and the climate finance that they are receiving is coming in the form of loans, exacerbating the debt crisis, and as a result, the climate crisis as well. When we went to COP29, those that were able to go and those that were able to participate virtually like me, we saw that there was a new target of climate finance, $300 billion. To developed countries, this seemed like a lot of money. But to the developing nations, they say this was a slap in the face. So we see that in the arena of climate finance, there is continual failure and disappointment and failing of communities that did not cause this crisis. The available climate finance is not enough for the mitigation needs of African countries. It's not enough for the adaptation needs of African countries. And if we are to talk about loss and damage, it is still not enough for our needs. So for me, as we head to COP30, we need to really address these inequalities. We are constantly having conferences that are not addressing the needs of the countries on the front lines of the climate crisis. And this is affecting our communities. This is affecting people's livelihoods. So for those who find themselves at COP30, let us push for grant-based finance. Climate finance is not a matter of charity. This is not charity. This is justice for people that have nothing to do with the climate crisis, and yet they are paying heavily for this crisis.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I'll move on to Uzo. Uzo, I know we've problematized the whole issue of climate finance, and that let's begin to think a bit about the solution. So my question for you would be, what role can the African region as a whole, or even the Commonwealth, I know you work with the Commonwealth, play in accelerating Africa's climate finance? What are the solutions? What role can African play in accelerating the problems and mitigating all of these injustices?
Thanks so much, and thanks to my fellow panel members for those really insightful discussions. So I think there's a lot we can do. There's a lot that's already happening. And to give some context, with 2.7 billion people, the Commonwealth actually represents a third of the world's population. So we have developed countries, developing countries, big states, small states. I think India is our largest country, with about 1.4 billion people, and Nauru has 10,000 people. So within the Commonwealth, you can expect that there's a lot of different perspectives and interests. Therefore, once a commitment is made by consensus, it is significant. Now, Africa is a major constituent of the Commonwealth, with about 21 member countries out of 56. Africa represents about 37 to 40% of the Commonwealth, so we have a strong stake in there. And our Commonwealth Secretary General, the Honorable Shirley Botchway, she'll be speaking to us this afternoon. She's the first female African Commonwealth Secretary General. So we are actually doing a lot. Now, in terms of solutions, and you talked about partnerships, this is where I want to speak to as well. We've heard about the climate finance gap from Dr. Olumide. We've also heard about how Vanessa has told us how there needs to be climate justice because we have not contributed the most but the least. In fact, what I want to say is we have the greatest mitigation potential on the continent. If we are to address the climate crisis globally, you have to be looking within Africa. So key things in here, especially when it comes to the negotiations, which we heard about as well. We need to come together with a strong, unified voice. We need to be that trusted convener and amplifier of our positions. Now, those decisions being taken at the highest discourse, we should be part and parcel of the rules making. And I'll give you some examples on what we've done within the continent, within the relevant partnerships. So you have the intergovernment organizations like ourselves, the Commonwealth. You also have multilateral development banks, which we've heard about, the MDBs. All sectors, all stakeholders, really important. But some key examples when it comes to de-risking investments, also showing absorptive capacity to bring in both public and private finance. At the regional level in partnerships, you're able to aggregate demand and scale, which is key. You know, economies of scale, getting the private capital to flow, that's key. At COP in Paris, there was the AREA, the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, developed by Africans and for Africa and managed by Africans. So that was in 2015, and phase one was to have about 10 gigawatt installed renewable energy by 2020, and that has been successful. So the next stage is to increase that to about 300 gigawatts. But something I also want to mention, the largest fund for climate, the Green Climate Fund, working together with the African Development Bank while there, also with the African Union, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, looking at what had happened in the past with the Global Environment Facility, the Climate Investment Funds. We said, not with this one. So we were on that transitional committee, working again with research institutes, you know, and the African stakeholders to make a case to say, when we are looking at resource allocation, we need to ensure that there is a balance between mitigation and adaptation, and we succeeded in that. So that's 50-50. You may not know, but in the past, most of the resources, over 90%, goes to mitigation. And we've just heard from Dr. Charles on how for Africa, adaptation is key. Another point we were able to push was, in addition to the SIDS, the small island developing states, least developing countries, that Africa would have a special recognition in terms of needs, and that is enshrined in the policies and procedures of the Green Climate Fund. So we have good examples in that as well, and I'll just speak to the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub, whereby, again, we know that there is the challenges that has been mentioned, but we're working on those solutions in ensuring we have long-term experts deployed. We call them Commonwealth National Climate Finance Advisors, embedded in our line ministries. They're not fly-in and fly-out consultants. They're staying for the long term with member countries to unpack and unravel the complex climate finance landscape. It could take anything from 6 months to 6 years to access this climate financing, but we are with our countries. And through the hub, we've supported over 7 to 10 member countries, and it's on the increase as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for your insights. I would go back again to Olumide, but Dr. Olumide. I had a follow-up question for the first one, but maybe I should reserve that, ask a new question. I'll come back to that one. And then I would ask that question to you and then Vanessa. But before that, following up on Uzo's own, I know you do a lot of policy stuff. What role can policy and research, evidence-based advocacy and research, play in influencing international climate finance, particularly in Africa? Just to, because I know a lot of people have questions, let's keep the responses a little brief, and then I'll move on.
Thanks for giving me the chance to advertise what I do. So I normally say, when you look at the US, you look at the think tanks in the US, and you can tell where policies are written and drafted when you look at the landscape. So the current one, you know who to blame, because we know what vision produced this. All of this is to say that we need evidence-based research to help us understand what can work. But to even start with, we need evidence. I mean, the numbers that I gave earlier came from research. But beyond those large numbers, we need them broken down. What do countries need? What do they have? What are they already doing by themselves? And what do they need support to do? Nationally, subnationally, sector-based. For many countries, we don't have this. At some point, I think a few years ago, we did some research on understanding climate finance in South Africa, Zambia, and in Ghana. And it was hard to get data because often countries are not collecting data in a structured way that could help make recommendations towards certain policies, right? So for example, the number that Vanessa mentioned earlier, 100 billion, even the reporting, the amount we know is spent, the amount we know is given, we know from those who have said they've given it, not from those who have received it, right? It's not easy to verify even the number that they said they have given. So we need research to help us understand just what the landscape is. That's one. Two, we need research to give us evidence for advocacy, for negotiations. I mean, Africa is present at the COP process. Africa is part of the UN SDG process. Africa is always in negotiations. But sometimes you have to ask yourself, what is supporting those negotiations? What knowledge are we producing to actually take to those places? How many of our African think tanks are capacitated enough to produce the kind of knowledge that can push advocacy forward credibly? We can make noise, and that's great. I mean, we need that. We need to make strong claims about certain things because we didn't create this mess. Those who created the mess, we know who they are. They got rich off of the creation of the problem that we have right now. But in order for us to make clear, credible demands and asks based on what we are seeing and experiencing, we need proper evidence-based research to back that up. I mean, I have a lot more to say, but I don't think we have time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would jump to Vanessa on this one, and then I'll come to Doc afterwards. So Vanessa, you're talking a lot about assessing climate finance, making it available, Western countries following up on their promises. I want to chip in the other side of the argument. You know, this conference is about changing narratives and making sure Africa owns up, becoming independent, reclaiming African sovereignty and narrative and agency. Why should we constantly rely on the West, on those who created the problems to help us fix our problems? Why should we still depend on their aid for climate finance? Why can't we own up? Because I know a lot of African countries don't even have national budgets for climate adaptation and mitigation. So why can't we just, we are talking about reparations as well. Why can't we forego that reparation narrative, but keep relying on the West, on the same people who created the problems to help us solve it?
Well, thank you for that question. Firstly, I would say this is the current system right now. If you work against the system will punish you. Africa cannot immediately cut off climate finance from developed countries because if we look realistically, that will not work. If you go to a region in Karamoja or a region in Turkana, communities that are experiencing food insecurity right now, if you shut down the tap of climate finance right now, because many of us in this place are in a privileged position, if the United Kingdom say they're going to cut their climate finance, how many of us here would be impacted by it? We will go back, we will live our lives, we will not be impacted at all. But there are communities on the front lines. Even when we say that Africa is on the front lines of the climate crisis, not all of us are on the front lines. There is a privilege for some of us. So I can clearly say that as much as we need our own countries to build resilience, to be able to have systems that can take care of our communities, we cannot afford to shut down right now. For the sake of the people that are impacted by cyclones in Southern Africa, for the sake of the people that are experiencing droughts in the Horn of Africa, for the sake of the people that are experiencing water insecurity in Chad and in Central Africa, we have to think about those people. Because these people go beyond statistics. When I ask climate finance is not for me. I have not lived an experience where I felt my life was in danger of the climate crisis. If where I'm living was to flood, that would be something that I experienced in that moment. But I can't say that this moment has happened before in my life where I felt threatened. However, there are communities that are living the climate crisis right now. We have the privilege to discuss the climate crisis. We have the privilege to share their stories and their experiences because they may never get the opportunities to step in the places that we are in for challenges and injustices of language barriers or lack of access to accreditation, funding. We've seen it with African activists that cannot attend climate conferences because they don't have funding, they don't have accreditation, they have visa issues. So it's really that if we cut off finance, we have to firstly ask, what is the person on the ground, on the front line, going to experience in that moment? And just to finalize, I visited Turkana and in 2022, and there was this drought that had affected the Turkana region, the worst that they had seen in 40 years. And I met mothers there, and I met children that were receiving treatment for malnutrition that has been caused as a result of food insecurity that has been caused by the drought in the region. So imagine if the finance tap is closed and that child who needs to receive that nutrition pest does not receive it that day. What is going to happen is that their situation is going to become much worse. So I advocate and argue for climate finance. Like I said, it's not charity, it is justice. Reparations are justice. So I argue for climate finance, I argue for reparations, even as our governments build systems of governance that ensure sustainability. We do advocate for debt cancellation as well, which we believe is important. But if debt cancellation happens and our countries don't build systems that ensure that we don't find ourselves in more debt, then in 10, 20 years, we are going to ask ourselves, we are going to ask developed countries to cancel our debt again. So this is where the balance is. The balance is, as climate finance comes into our communities, our governments take responsibility for our communities as well.
Thank you very much. Uzo, I'm going to follow up, and I'm going to ask you the same question. What is your thought on it? Why should we, is it necessary that we still rely on the donors and founders to do mitigation and adaptation, or should Africa move beyond that? I found this question very intriguing. I want to know your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. We are in a global space, and I want to talk about responsibility and accountability. Now, we are in partnership as well. And if you're looking at us within the African continent, we also have our own space and room to grow. I want to also turn it on its head and say, again, without the continent, without our resources, without our intellect, we would not be able to address the climate challenge. However, based on the laws and the principles, as has been enshrined in UNFCCC, you have accountability and you need to meet up with your pledges and your commitments. Now, having said that, I also want to put a charge for us within the African continent and to also demonstrate what has been happening to this effect, wherein we need to ensure that within these rules of the game, we're able to speak up and demand what we need. And just to give us the coordination and institutional process that has been established, and again, within those partnerships, we have at the technical level, the Africa Group of Negotiators, that then goes up to the ministerial level, AMCEN, so the African Ministerial and the Council on Environment for African Ministers, looking at wider environment and climate change. And then you have CAHOSC, the Conference of the African Heads of State on Climate. And this is important when you talk about the means of implementation. You have finance, capacity building, and technology. Therefore, we keep demanding for those flows that have been made as commitments, those pledges need to be met. So that's really key. One last point on this, though, is to say that in terms of making sure that those who have been the most affected, the most vulnerable, they're not only meant to be looked at within the lens of pity. No, they are solution providers. So when you look at women, look at young people, and Vanessa has really articulated this very well. What about those people in the communities? We talk about technology a lot. Indigenous technology has proven time and again, it has gone through the test of time, and we need to look at how we bridge indigenous technologies and relevant modern technology together as well. Just to say, in terms of the practical steps, we've also worked within the Commonwealth family, and of course with a focus on Africa now, to say We do bring together our young people. So we've trained young people. We have the Commonwealth negotiations training for youth, and we have also taken them to COP. We also work to bring indigenous people to those platforms so that they have a chance to speak to their lived experience. There's no better negotiator or advocate than one who has experience and is experiencing and is set to experience climate. So we also bring that to the meetings themselves to speak and advocate for themselves. So a unified voice with lived experience would make that case for the finance to flow. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So Dr. Charles, this question is for you. Following up on that, I know you write a lot on decolonizing resilience, decolonizing adaptation. You use decolonial theories a lot in most of your papers and your projects. I'm thinking there is a whole argument that climate finance has become a form of neocolonialism, where the West, through the imposition of like Vanessa, Uzo, and Olumide said, through the imposition of loans, they give loans to African countries to keep them in a perpetual cycle of dependency. I want to know your take on this. Do you think climate finance that comes to Africa is a genuine representation of the actual objectives of that, or it's a way of colonizing African countries, a new form of neo-colonization, as Kwame Nkrumah would put it?
Thank you very much. But I know you are hard-pressed with time, but if you oblige me, can I make a brief comment on...
Please, you can. Go ahead.
Yes. I have a difficulty anytime Africans ask for justice and, reparation. Nobody has asked the Germans why they ask for reparations about Holocaust. They keep on asking for reparations and justice from Holocaust. But when it comes to Africa, why are you people always playing victim? Why are you people always asking for reparation? That, for me, is hypocrisy of the highest order. And I think that we should begin to, rethink in these areas. So to the question of neocolonialism and, as to whether, climate finance is a way of controlling Africans, I think so. First and foremost, many of the discussions about climate finance are discussed in what I call the languages of power. In French, in English, and in heavy jargons. Meanwhile, within African society, we can have adaptation and resilience embedded in African languages. We can find them in our proverbs, we can find them in our songs, we can find them in our music, we can find them in our poetry, and so on and so forth. How come all these issues about climate finance and resilience and co are written in French, in English, and in heavy jargons? That smacks of some kind of, imperialistic and neo-colonial, logic. Two, we are giving you funding, yet you have no agency about it. We sit in Washington and Berlin or Bonn or Geneva or London and design the plans for you, by so-called international consultants. What is the ownership of Africa when it comes to climate finance? Zilch. Even the traditional authorities and women farmers and youth networks are barely included when it comes to climate finance. The voices of Africa is virtually absent. We need to begin to recenter the voices of Africa in policy making when it comes to climate finance. So I think that in as much as they continue to control and determine and plan and design for us what we should do in Africa, it smacks of a certain kind of, neo-colonial logic.
Thank you so much. I'll go back to Olumide on this one. So first of all, I would like to know your take briefly on that. Is climate finance a tool for neocolonialism? And second, how can, I know, again, policy stuff, how can Africans actually develop a local responsive finance mechanism that center on African agency and dependence and not overly relying on the West? So 2 questions. First, is climate finance a way of colonizing African countries into subordination, into domination, into subjugation? And the second one has to do with how can we recenter Africans or reposition Africans at the center of climate finance mobilization?
Okay, how long do we have? Okay.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes before we take questions. So let's.
Okay, so let's.
2 minutes.
I have to. Okay.
2 minutes.
If I had the answer to that, I would. Yeah. But first of all, I have a colleague who likes saying that there's nothing like climate finance. There's finance.
There's what?
There's finance.
Finance. Okay.
Because, see, it's really hard to not be angry sometimes about these climate finance discussions. Because if we know, and we do know, that the most vulnerable have the least capacity to adapt to this, why are we discussing climate finance in these terms? Why are we talking about climate finance in terms that can easily turn it into loans? I mean, the most vulnerable can't afford loans. Why are we talking about climate finance in a way that can lead us towards talking about loans? That's problematic for me. That's just a basic thing. My daughter, a few years ago, was asking me what I was doing at COP, and I was trying to explain to her. So I said, imagine there are two groups of people, right? Some are rich, and in the process of getting rich, they created a problem. Then there's another group of people who are not rich, and they are not rich in part because they didn't create the problem that the other group created. But now they're suffering from the effects of that. And she said, well, I mean, why are they not just giving them money to help them? Because they created the mess. And I said, thank you very much. So I should record this and play it in climate conferences, because I don't think there's anything like climate finance. It is finance. And that leads me to answering your question, which is sort of what can African countries do. There's a lot that we cannot do by ourselves as Africans. I mentioned earlier the global financial architecture, which we did not set and which is difficult for us to make work for us. However, there are certain things that we can do by ourselves, and some of them we're already doing. One of them is the simple question. If there is nothing like climate finance, especially when you're talking to the private sector, the same reason that you cannot find finance internationally to finance your infrastructure projects is the same reason that you won't be able to get the climate finance, right? Because actually, apart from that, the same reason that your domestic investors are not investing in infrastructure projects is the same reason that international investors will not invest in them. So what can we do by ourselves to at least start mobilizing the resources we have to address some of the challenges that we face, while we're, of course, making the case that those who created the mess have to pay for cleaning up the mess, right? Or at least have to pay to help us deal with the effects of the mess that was created. So we have examples. Uzo already mentioned some examples from the AFDB and the UN and the African Union. There are also examples like the Rwanda Green Fund, which is sort of to mobilize resources that can give grants and very low-cost loans to SMEs in the country. And right now, given the current situation we're in the world, I think Global South countries have to work together and learn from each other and see what has worked and what hasn't worked in their context. And we can begin starting in Africa. What has worked on the continent in certain countries? Is the Rwanda Green Fund working? If it's working, how is it working? What can we learn from that? Can we copy that in other parts of the continent? And moving outside the continent, how did Indonesia negotiate a JETP? Is the JETP good for African countries? A few weeks ago, we had an event in Abuja where we brought, with the Ministry for Budget and Economic Planning, we brought Indonesia, South Africa, Vietnam, Senegal to Abuja to discuss with their Nigerian counterparts how they did how they coordinated themselves to raise the financing they did under the JETP, and whether JETP is actually good for Nigeria, and whether they would do a JETP again if they were starting from scratch. This is not Chatham rules, so I won't go into the details of what was discussed there. But the point is this: we need to look inwards and consider what has already worked for us, and then we also need to look at what others who are similar to us have done and what has worked for them, and see what we can learn from them.
Thank you very much. I gave you 2 minutes. You spoke for 5 to 6 minutes. I'll take the last round of questions. But panelists, please, let's keep this very short, very brief. Then we can go to the audience and take some more questions. I'll start from Uzo. In terms of climate finance mobilization and acquisition and mobilization. How can we move from what I call token participation, where it seems like communities are being involved in decision-making, it seems like indigenous groups are being involved in decision-making, where in fact, in reality, decisions are taken somewhere in Geneva, in Paris, and being dumped on these local communities. So looking at the solutions, how do you think local communities, indigenous groups, small communities in Africa can actually take part in decision-making of climate finance? So we're beginning to think more about the solutions. What is the way forward, and how can we recenter climate financing, or financing, as Olumide says, within local communities?
Thank you so much. So most of the discussions, like you all heard, is at the international level, but it's a loop. It has to be cascaded down, and then at the same time, you have to get that information flow from the local communities back to the top. Now, we cannot do the work we're doing in isolation of the systems at play. It's more like if there are rules in a game, who is setting those rules? Who are the identified actors within those rules? How do you get them to collaborate and engage? Let me start from the international space and then come downwards as well to the sub-regional level and community level. But across board, you have to make sure that your voice is heard. You need to make sure you're part of those governance structures. We've heard the word agency. I think from the experience we've had, especially with our Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub, that's 10 years now, is that the national funds are actually driving change. So you also have sub-regional funds driving change as well. And within that, you're able to ensure that you have direct access, but also determine where your flows are going to and how and why, and who the players are. And this is whereby you ensure that you have everyone at the table meaningfully represented, including those community leaders. So the flow that we actually have a good country example, whereby the communities themselves elect their representatives, be it at the chiefdom level, that then go all the way up to the county, national level, and then they go to represent in the international level, and they then come back. So we have an accountability system, so up, ways, and side down. But I just want to also emphasize what I'd mentioned earlier, the technical, the ministerial, and then the heads of government process. So the Africa Group of Negotiators, and then going on to AMSEN, the ministers on environment, and then the heads of state responsible for climate. Now, what is the instrument they work with? It's called the African Common Position on Climate Change. If I was to ask by a show of hands, how many people have ever seen the African Common Position on Climate Change in this room? How many of us have heard about it? How many of us have read it? So we push for this to be cascaded across board, whereby when you talked about the community, civil society, they are actually watchdogs and agents of change as well. And it's important for us to recognize that role, which we do, and get them as part of that process. Now, they engage with the national climate change focal point, who's usually lead negotiator at that high level, and their voice is able to be represented at that scale. And we ensure that they go back to report to them on what was achieved. Now, there are also different ways to engage them in the projects being designed, and this is what I was coming to say. Regional funds, and I'll start with the Africa Climate Change Fund that we'd worked on at the AFDB with partners. Now, this particular fund was to push to ensure that you're actually ready to access the international funds in themselves, because there's something called climate finance readiness in itself. Before you can access those funds, there's the upfront costs that most of our member countries were not able to access, including those communities as well. So that is a practical and tangible resource and element that we've put in place. And then you've heard from Abimbola about the Rwanda Fund. There's several others on the continent, but we're also engaging, to make sure the perception of risk, and I think this is something I just want to land on. We have to redefine what risk means across board, because I don't think, especially now within this landscape, that working in Africa is riskier than any other part in the world. And this is one of the elements in which we do work with the MDBs, private sector, to de-risk investments, aggregate skill, make sure those economies of skill are attractive, basically getting bankable projects attractive to the investments as well, and making sure it responds to those in need, the vulnerable ones in communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'll move to Vanessa. Vanessa, please, let's keep the time. We are behind time, so let's keep it very brief. What is the role of activism? I know you are an activist, you advocate a lot of climate justice, and you talk a lot about inequalities, injustices. What is the role of activism in actually sort of putting pressure on the system? Do you think it's effective, and how is it going? And do you think that conversation is something we can have beyond this, and where activism play a huge role in the mobilization of climate finance?
Yeah, thank you so much. I personally think that we wouldn't be here without activism. We wouldn't be here without social movements. If you think about the civil rights movement, many of us in this space are able to speak because of people that came together in the civil rights movement. If you're to think about the women's rights movements, I wouldn't be speaking on this panel. I probably wouldn't be in school if certain women didn't come together to say that women deserve a right to school, to their own careers. I probably wouldn't even have a bank account. I promise you, many of the women here, you would not have access to a bank account if it wasn't for women activists. And I think it's the same with climate. Without activism, we cannot be able to see justice. Even the independence movements that we saw across Africa, it is people that came together and built powerful public narratives that talked about protection, that talked about access, and all these led to the independence that we've seen in our countries. So for me, I think activism is it is necessary for our societies, because without activism, we wouldn't be able to access freedom, we wouldn't be able to access choice, we wouldn't be able to access justice. And I know that many people, when they hear that you are an activist, they automatically think that you're everything wrong. They automatically think you're the people that are blocking our roads, you're the people that are doing this. But let me tell you, if certain people didn't block roads, if certain women didn't speak up in a certain generation, we wouldn't be here in this place. We wouldn't be studying. I think I would probably thank you so much. I think I would probably be in my home village right now, probably with about 5 children, I think, without my choice, because society would have made me to believe that that is what I am expected to do as a woman. So we really shouldn't criminalize activists, because many of them across the world are being arrested. Thousands of indigenous environmental defenders are murdered because they give a damn about the environment. And it goes back to what Dr. Charles was saying. We really can't move forward without indigenous wisdom. Indigenous people preserved our ecosystems before the global north world started to think about sustainability. Some people think being a climate activist is a cool thing. Some people think caring about sustainability is a cool thing. But this was embedded in our systems for hundreds and thousands of years. And it's because of that that we stand here. I stand here because of women like Professor Wangari Maathai. I am a person who believes that every new birth is as a result of an old womb. If I am to stand strongly as an activist, it is because of a certain woman, it is because of a certain man, it is because of a certain someone that dreamed for me. So I may not see the justice in climate that I may seek right now, but probably 100 years from now, someone will say the environment is in a much better place because people like Vanessa dreamt for people like us.
Thank you so much. That was indeed powerful. Doc, please keep it to 30 seconds. We need to take some questions. So, Doc, quick question. Vanessa mentioned it again, thinking about indigenous knowledge, indigenous wisdom in the making of climate change policies. My research is focused on that, and so you could see that most often than not, these policies are designed by experts and implemented in communities, and they had no say. And more often than not, they fail, and sometimes they lead to resistance. So, Doc, looking forward, what should be the next steps in terms of climate finance, and not just climate finance, in terms of how policies and projects are designed and implemented? I need your final take on that, but please keep it short. We need to take some questions.
How policies are designed?
Yes, in terms of the way forward on how climate policies and projects should be designed to include indigenous knowledge. I know you write a lot on decolonizing resilience. So link it to the issues of decolonization and how the way forward for Africa.
But Clement, I have a difficulty with the word inclusion.
Okay.
We have been included in so many things, but how did you go? I would rather say we need to begin to center the voices of Africans in policy making. We are in there. We are taking part. We are intimately involved in the process. By including us or giving us recognition, for me, doesn't do anything. Again, I think that we also begin to, shift the discourse from charity to that of co-creation, co-production. Africans, we produce knowledge. We are not just passive recipients of knowledge. They are not doing us any favor. They created the mess in the first place. So we need collaboration, partnership, and involving us intimately in policy making, rather than giving us, recognition or including us. Because I'm saying that we should be brief, so I'll stop here, or I can continue.
No, please, you may end here. There will be some time afterwards. If any of the audience wants to interact with you, they can. So following up, I think I should end it here for some questions. So I can take, how many questions? Okay, I'll take 3 questions for now. I'm going to balance the agenda. First, I'll go with Kelly. Kelly, if you can have the mic. Kelly Ann. But please introduce yourself first.
Okay, sure. Hi, I'm Kelly Ann. I used to do the MPhil in Development Studies here, now working at IOM. I am going to give Dr. Amo-Agyemang the opportunity to continue on the question that Clement asked. So I really was touched by your comments on resilience and how we have to move from a Eurocentric approach or lens to a more Afrocentric one that looks at relationships and the relation to the environment. IOM works with internally displaced people. Their team sits next to me in my office. And increasingly, we see internally displaced persons by virtue of climate shocks. My question to you is, how can multilateral organizations, such as IOM, effectively support resilience and reframe from the Eurocentric lens with view to internally displaced people? Thank you.
Okay, one more question. I'm going to take David right here, and then I'll go to the back. So, David, yeah. Okay.
Hi, good morning. My name is David, and I am from Ghana. I'm just going to keep this very brief. So my question borders on climate finance, and I want to find out that considering the continent, Africa's vulnerability to climate change, and the huge debt that we have, how exactly can debt swaps or debt forgiveness be integrated into the climate financing structure so that we can reinvest these monies into green financing? Thank you.
Thank you. Preferably a woman. So, Luhano, the one behind you. Yes.
Hello and thanks. I'm Tamilare. I'm a researcher at the Martin School. I'm typically very bored by climate panels, so I want to give props to this panel because I've really been able to follow everything that's been said. So thank you for sharing your wisdom and insights. My question is on the stats that Dr. Abimbola shared about, I think, 50% of climate inflows go to just 10 countries in Africa, and then the 10 most vulnerable countries just get 10% of that. How do you assess vulnerability in terms of how do you know which countries, or how do you rank or assess which countries are most vulnerable? And the second part of that question is how to then get those vulnerable countries to be able to have, is it better bargaining power at the table when they need to get more climate influence or to prove their vulnerability, if that's the case? Then the second question is that I think we all
Sorry, can you keep it to one question?
Just one question, okay.
I would give the opportunity to one more woman. One more woman, so that...
And I think a non-Oxford person.
A non-Oxford person. Anyone out of Oxford who is a woman?
A woman.
We have.
Yeah. Balance.
Yes. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Stella. I'm from Ghana. Now, the question is Africa creating these challenges with climate so that we take finance? Because I see when you come back home in Ghana, now we have our water bodies all destroyed, we have our forests getting destroyed, and we are seeking finance. Are we creating them to get the finance? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I don't know in what order you want to answer the questions, but the first one I think was directed directly to Dr. Charles on indigenous knowledge. Can you?
No, he asked about how can IOM learn
yes.
to do the
Eurocentric way of...
Okay, so then they can do so by teaming up with African scholars or universities and activists and academic think tanks and policy centers to strengthen the capacity of these internally displaced people by giving them regular workshops and talking to them. Yeah.
Thank you. So they would follow.
Yeah. Just to quickly try to also answer that question, contribute to that. I think by starting to learn from what they're already doing, because very often people those who are dealing with issues are not waiting for someone to come and help them. They are already doing something to help themselves. So how about we learn what they're doing to help themselves and maybe base whatever we do on that? And this also extends actually to resilience in general. People who are facing drought are not waiting for policymakers to come and help them. They're already doing something. What can we learn from that? And then how can we maybe make that, I don't know, travel to other places, because some other places have the same issues. How can they, those models travel? How can they become part of policies if possible? So starting from actually learning what people are doing would be a great idea. To the question on the vulnerable countries, I didn't do the ranking. If I were to do the ranking, it probably would look differently, but I didn't do it. However, that's the current landscape. It's the countries with, there's a list of vulnerable countries, and we have the V20, which is part of the UNFCCC process. So there is a list of vulnerable countries with the definitions that explain vulnerability. How can they access more financing? By working together. Would be one of the ways to do it, but by working within the system would be a way to do it, and by looking for other ways and avenues of raising financing that extend beyond the current system, which we all know isn't working. We don't have much time.
Thank you. So I think for David, just to say yes to your point, in terms of the need for innovative financing, blended financing to scale this up. So we already have experiences, and we've demonstrated and shown debt for climate swaps do work. We have examples within the African continent, especially in Seychelles. Even in addition to debt for climate swaps, it's even broader, debt for nature swaps. And we have a debt management unit. We're working to push this out across member countries within Africa and elsewhere. But I also want to just push that envelope to even talk about the special drawing rights within the IMF and that allocation that is unused by developed countries, and to make a case, and this case is being made by African leaders as well, to say this should be redirected to African countries to push climate action. I think Tamilore, if I was going to add to that, to say the point about vulnerability, these assessments, there's several that have been done. there's the climate risk vulnerability assessments. There's evidence to show our countries are the most vulnerable. Like I explained, even within the negotiations themselves and the work that we've done across the AGN, AMSA and AU, we're able to demonstrate and show that Africa should have special recognized needs. There's a specific term, and that has been recognized at the level of the UNFCCC, so United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and therefore whereby you have SEEDs, Small Island Developing States, the LDCs, you then have Africa recognized. That's the only continent recognized. So we have proven beyond reasonable doubt, and this is where we're pushing to say for accountability, those commitments need to be made and those finances need to flow for action.
And I don't know whether the question from my sister from Ghana was aimed at, was it for me or for all of us?
Yeah.
You can take it.
So can I?
You can take it.
Okay, so I get your point. I am sure you're referring to the illegal mining in Ghana.
Yes, like the Galamsey.
Popularly known as Galamsey. Is it Galamsey?
For example.
And at Galamsey, we are doing Galamsey illegal mining deliberately so that we can get finance from elsewhere. Is that what you're saying?
Sorry, can we get her microphone though?
No, I just want clarity, so just cool down.
Yeah.
Briefly, please.
So looking at all the challenges that we are facing in terms of climate, are Africans the one causing these challenge with the climate so that we get finance, external support? That's what I'm trying to ask.
Okay. In as much as we are partly, part of the problem, it cannot be compared to the unprecedented ecological destruction that has been caused by the capitalist extractivist logic. It cannot be compared. In fact, it pays into insignificant. Completely, it cannot be compared. We are contributing minimally to that. Those who are to be blamed are the capitalist extractivists of the West. So I agree with you to a very large extent that we are also contributing to that. However, I do not think that what we are contributing is enough. The blame must be placed at the right door. That is from the capitalist extractivist.
Okay. Vanessa, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, my answer was simply no. We are not creating our own problems to get finance, because these are problems that are as a result of historical activities. And to give context, like I said before, Africa is responsible for less than 4% of global emissions. Those are 54 countries. The United States alone is responsible for about 25%. One country. So if you look at Europe as well, if you look at China's emissions, current emissions right now, so you really see that we are not creating problems to get climate finance. If that was the way to access it, we would be seeing that. Small coastal communities are not responsible for the industrial impacts of overfishing. There is a recent documentary that was made by Sir David Attenborough on oceans and the impacts on oceans, and he explored how some of the coastal communities in Africa are being impacted by industrial fishing. So you have communities that have for hundreds of years been able to manage their fishing, experiences. They know how much to get for their families, but now they cannot access their source of food or income because corporations are coming to take what belonged to the small coastal communities. So it's really important to know that the problem here is industries, big corporations. Trust me, you did not put an oil spill in any lake. You probably will never do that. None of us will ever do that. We are not responsible for oil spills. But who gets impacted by that? It is local communities.
Sorry, one last sentence. I know. I just want to say, actually, I think of those things, deforestation in those contexts, as maladjustment to the effects of climate change, to not having the resources to actually deal with it properly. It's people just trying to adapt. So it's not. The answer to your question is no.
Okay, thank you so much. Because of time, we can't take any more questions. But like I said, our panelists will be around if you have any questions.